Our teachers come to us with ideas and things that could improve a process or a question about a priority. And if we can take their feedback and implement that, we would be crazy not to do that, right? Because we're not the ones that have to come up with all the ideas.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
Welcome back, everyone. It's time for another episode on the Teacher Edition podcast. I'm so glad you've made us a part of your day. For those of you who haven't visited our website, it is teachereditionpodcast.com. There is a whole library of episodes there now. We are coming into year 3, so there's a large variety of topics for your use. Whether you've been with us over the past 2 years or you are just joining in, don't forget you can go back anytime and get some of that great content. You can also find us on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook as well. So go follow, like, and give us a rating. We appreciate that feedback, and it really does help others find the show as well. By the way, we're looking for some new audience questions. So take a moment to think of something you would like to ask, and then go leave us a quick voice message on our website, and you'll hear that question answered in one of our upcoming episodes. I am really excited to welcome Matt Ticzkus back to the show. Matt joined us way back in 2023 as we were just launching the show. He shared some great information about motivating students. That episode has definitely ranked as a favorite. So for those of you who don't know Matt, or you didn't catch that episode, Matt earned a master's degree in Christian school education and another master's degree in Bible exposition. He served for a number of years as a school administrator in Texas. Matt is currently the regional director for the Mid-South region of the American Association of Christian Schools, where he's having a great impact with those schools and in Christian education in general. Matt stays busy outside of work as well. By far, his most important responsibility is his family. He and his wife have 3 children. He also founded and leads a small e-commerce company, and he actively serves in his community. So I've had the privilege of knowing Matt for many, many years. Actually, he probably will hate if I say this, since he was in elementary school. I believe that's when I met him. I appreciate his testimony, and he's just doing such great work in Christian education. Matt, I'm so excited to have you. Welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you. And has it really been since 2023 that's when we were on the podcast?
Yes.
I honestly can't believe that.
I can't believe it either. I was thinking back. I can't believe that was almost 2 years ago. Well,
that's unbelievable. But thank you for having me back, and I appreciate the work you're doing here on the podcast. And I'm looking forward to our discussion today. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Well, yeah, I was thinking the same thing. So you speak quite frequently to educators. You've been in schools, you've served in schools, you bring a lot to the table when you speak. So one of the topics you talk about is things almost every administrator wish their teachers knew. So you wanted to talk about that today. That's very intriguing for sure. As we jump into it, tell me about the word almost in your title. I assume you included that intentionally. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, look, what I did for this session was I went out and interviewed current and former administrators, and I just said, what are some things that you wished your teachers understood, but maybe you really didn't feel like you could communicate those things to your teachers? And so that's where the genesis of this session came from. And so when I say almost, I mean, I would never say every administrator, right?
Right.
And I realize this is not some type of peer-reviewed research that I've done. It's a fairly small sample size.
Ticzkus research.
Yeah. It's Ticzkus reviewed and definitely
that's good.
Definitely approved. So when I say almost, I feel like almost everyone will agree with the things that we say. Now, look, this is definitely not all inclusive. There's more things that could be added, but I think there's some really interesting themes that came to the forefront when we had the discussion with these administrators.
Okay, so there are all kinds of topics out there that you could have covered. I mean, being in education, the topics are endless. Why this? What brought you to develop this session?
I think relationships are just so important. And, sometimes I think of myself sometimes kind of like an evangelist where I can come in and maybe say some things that like the pastor doesn't feel like he can say at a church, or like, if you have children, that you might tell your children something over and over and over again, and it doesn't click. And then they have a coach or a teacher at school that says the same thing that you've been saying for like 10 years. but it makes a connection. I feel a little bit like I have that opportunity to kind of come in as maybe an outside voice and just share some things that sometimes are difficult to just talk about in our relationships and our time together. So that was kind of the genesis of where this came from. Yeah.
Okay, you said things. So, as educators, that's a little broad. We don't do things. What are the things that you're referring to, the things you share with them, the things you found?
Yeah, so there were 4 themes that really came to the forefront as we were as I was doing this very in-depth research project that I was doing. One was about decisions. The second was on relationships. And then the third was finances. And then the fourth was work. And so what I do is I walk through the session as I walk through each of those themes. And I actually have little quotes that I pulled from the administrators. And that's really helpful in their, to kind of hear it in their voice as they're describing that. And then we walk through that theme and some different parts of that. And then, I share an admonition for leaders when I finish that theme, and then I share an admonition for the teachers. And by the way, it has been brought to my attention as I've taught this session that we could also do a session, things almost every teacher wished their administrator understood about them. So let me put that out there that I totally understand that. I'm just coming from the position
your
that
next
I was.
assignment.
Yeah. And they've told me I need to do that. So we'll see.
Yes, you should. We'll have you back for that. Okay. So of those things that popped out there, let's talk relationships maybe a little bit. And maybe we can get a little sneak peek into what you share in those sessions so you can share that with our listeners. What would you say are some of the common areas of tension between teachers and school leaders? What did you find?
Yeah, I found a couple things that were really interesting. And I don't think anything is surprising here. But again, here's what we found, right? I call it the friend dilemma, right? So if the administrator and let's say the teacher both have children and their friends are their kids, are friends, sometimes conflict happens between middle school students, right? And so right. I know that's surprising.
In Texas too?
Yeah, it happens everywhere. But what does that do to the relationship when our kids start having maybe some tension in their relationships? Discipline and correction. An administrator may have to administer discipline to a teacher's child, or an administrator may have to discipline a teacher or correct a teacher in some way. And so that can definitely cause tension in the relationship. Of course, there's things like generational differences, gender differences, philosophical differences. We live in an age where technology is prevalent and some school leaders really push technology and some teachers don't really like that. And then the reverse could also be true. So there could be some philosophical differences. And then I also say, obviously leaders are humans and, hypocrisy or a double standard by a leader can also cause tension. And of course, we know that scripture tells us, and I think we'll probably even talk about this a little bit, that, pride and arrogance can also be a place where tension comes up in a relationship. And then poor communication, right? When a leader doesn't communicate well, if a teacher doesn't communicate well, those things can absolutely cause tension in a relationship.
Okay, so the communication thing you mentioned there, probably not a surprise to anyone.
Yeah.
So as a side note, though, I wonder if we could run with that just a second. Sure. What would you say is the best way to communicate within an organization in your experience? I mean, that comes up all the time, that communication can be an issue. What's your advice on that? Yeah,
my good friend Scott Barron with School Growth taught me something about communication that has absolutely stuck with me. And I think it is... I always say it's worth the price of admission to this session alone. If teachers and leaders just grab this, of course, it's always free to come to the session, I suppose. So, but nonetheless, it's this concept of up, out, down, and around. So if I have information that needs to be shared, I want to make sure I share it up to my superior first, because I want to make sure I don't want them hearing something from someone else that they should have heard from me, right? As a man, my wife occasionally in the past may have learned about something that was on my schedule or on my calendar that I was doing that she didn't hear from me. And you know what? That doesn't always go over well when that happens, right? So, up, out, down, around. So out would be to my peers, right? So if there's multiple folks, on, my level of leadership, then I want to make sure that they hear that from me. out would be to the rest of the folks on the team. So up, out, down, and then around would be to the whole community. Like, so in a school setting, you'd want that, you'd think of that in terms of like your school families or things. So that for me, when I learned that, was absolutely game changing.
Sure. Because
people, how you share information with people communicates to them how you value them in the relationship. And so up, out, down, around, really important.
Excellent. Excellent principle. Yeah, I've heard him mention that. I'm so glad you brought that back. I haven't thought about that in a while. That's really good. Okay, so much of what you're talking about already, it could be describing just about any organization at times, communication, relationship, things like that. This podcast is geared towards Christian school educators, and we want to focus on solutions, obviously from a biblical worldview. What would you say are some biblical principles that we should consider as we look at relationships between, let's say, teachers and admins? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we have to realize that conflict is a reality, and conflict's going to happen. I mean, we even see in Galatians 2, I think I've got it here, where Peter and Paul had conflict. And so as humans, we're going to have conflict. And it's going to come down to how are we going to handle that conflict when it happens. But I also know that Proverbs teaches us that a lot of our conflict, and I mentioned this earlier, comes because of pride or arrogance. None of us like correction. None of us like to be wrong. And as leaders, we have to be really careful in how we communicate things and how we treat people, because everything that we do is looked at very carefully. But we have to watch for pride, because that is the source of a lot of our issues. But in Psalm 133, it talks about how unity, it's so pleasant when brothers dwell together in unity. And so when there is teamwork, right? Teamwork makes the dream work, right? I mean, that's kind of a cliche saying, but it's so true. When we're working together, it is a beautiful thing to behold. And that just improves the culture of our school and our organization. And it makes it a place where students want to come and learn and where families want to be. And that's super important, because if there's conflict between staff members on a consistent basis, that's gonna make for a very difficult learning environment. And then I think in Ephesians 5, Scripture talks about submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. So we are to submit to one another as Christians, and even as leaders, we need to be willing to sometimes submit our way of doing things or our thoughts to our teachers, and we better be willing to do that and have enough humility to do that.
Yeah. Like how you said, it's not, if conflict comes, conflict will come. That's how it is working with people. But
100%.
Great. And I love the idea of, we just got to keep watching our pride. And sometimes, we can think as administrators, I'm the leader of this, this is what I want to do. But, humbly looking at other people's thoughts and input and what's best for the group. Yeah, just so many things play into that. But those are great admonitions. I appreciate the scripture you brought into that too. Another topic that you mentioned was decisions. So that is a really hard topic. Whether you make decisions easily or you're an indecisive person, decisions in a school can be so tricky and so stressful. I'm here to tell you, there is just so much to consider. Decisions are far-reaching. There are a lot of moving parts in a school. And, leaders must consider all the stakeholders when they make a decision. And sometimes that's easier said than done, or sometimes forgotten in haste or whatever. Matt, who do you see as those stakeholders when it comes to the Christian school environment?
Yeah, I identify at least 12 different stakeholders that a leader has to look at when they're making decisions in a school context. So not all of these would apply to every school situation, but I've listed the pastor. And again, not every school is going to be a church-based school, so that may not apply. But a board chair, school board members, donors, parents, teachers, students. Obviously, some of these are pretty obvious. Community members, church members, other local church leaders, right? So even if we're not a church-based school, as a Christian school, we have other churches that are feeding into our enrollment. So we have to consider that. Then I put grandparents and then church staff members. And I think that covers, there may be one or two more, but a leader has a lot to think about as they're making decisions, how it's going to impact each of these different groups.
So when you're talking decisions, when it comes to especially administration, it would be impossible to talk about or cover every scenario, every situation. They come rapid fire. I know so many times after going home, when I was an administrator, go home and my husband would say, "What's for dinner?" I was like, you know what? You decide.
Yeah.
I've done my decision quota for
Chick-fil-A.
today. I know that's
again.
right. Yes, the fallback. Okay, so take those decisions, I guess, can we put them in main areas when a administrator's constantly feeding out decisions? How could we classify those maybe?
Yeah, for sure. And let me point this out. Most likely, when leaders make decisions, and this is important for teachers to understand, someone is going to be unhappy with the decision that was made. I mean, that is just a reality. But as I talked to the administrators from my very highly peer-reviewed research, 4 areas kind of came to the forefront. That was people, decisions related to people, decisions about priorities, decisions about processes, and then to stick with the P. And again, I think in terms of church-based schools, because that's a lot of who I work with, I put the pastor, right? So those were the 4 areas of decisions that we cover.
Okay, so those are all weighty. You know, every one of them has some pretty big stuff going on there. But people decisions definitely have a way of, I think, weighing extra heavy generally. What type of people decisions are you referring to or did you hear about?
Yeah, absolutely. I love Jim Collins' work, Good to Great. And it's obviously Jim Collins not a Christian author, but in that book, he talks about how in an organization, you think of your organization like a bus. And sometimes we have people, our staff members, in seats on that bus, and sometimes they are, they need to change seats, right? And maybe we've seen this as a leader, right? Someone's teaching in middle school, but they really need to be teaching in elementary school, right? But the difficult part about leadership, and especially in Christian ministry, is that sometimes people have to get off of the bus, right? Which means that we have to make a difficult decision about someone who can't stay working, as a teacher at our school potentially. Right. So, of course, hiring and firing is a difficult part of that job, especially the firing part, for sure. But other areas of decisions as it relates to people, student admission, your teachers have very little say in the students that come into the school, right? A lot of times it's an administrative decision, it's an admissions decision. So decisions around decisions around student admission, student discipline is also a big thing. Sometimes I think teachers feel like, I send a student to the office to be dealt with, and what happened? What did that look like? It doesn't seem like anything happened sometimes. So that can be an area that's difficult. And then also staff discipline, right? When, there are moments when a leader has to give correction or discipline to staff members, and that can be really difficult.
Yeah. All good things for teachers, the daily grind of an administrator. And those are hard. And I think most administrators, or at least their heart, would not be to make decisions lightly or carelessly, and just understanding when somebody has to make a hard decision, it weighs on you. It's a hard thing. Okay, another thing that I wrote down, so we talked about people, but what about priorities? When you talk about priorities, what would admins want their teachers to know in that category of priorities? Let
me read you one quote from an administrator before we talk priorities, because I thought this was really good. The administrator said this: "We can really love people who aren't a good fit for the organization. Sometimes we have to correct and or release people we really care for." So just, underline what you said. But when we talk about priorities, administrators, the difficult thing about leading a school, and I think the smaller your school is, the harder it is to do this in some ways, because you get sucked into the day-to-day operations, of the school. This class needs a sub, and just all, this parent needs to meet with you, all those things that happen. But as a leader, if we're not spending time looking down the road 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, our organization is going to stagnate if we're not careful, and if we're not careful about that. So teachers sometimes, they have their area of focus that they're working on, and that's what they are hired to do. But sometimes when it comes to decisions that a leader has to make, the priorities are looking down the road and not just what's before us, right? And some other practical areas that this comes into play, how dollars are spent, right? Maybe we all
very
want,
difficult one.
Yeah. We all want things, need things for our classrooms, but sometimes there is a greater need beyond, and sometimes maybe a teacher, they're just not able to see that because, again, they're looking at their one area.
Sure. Yeah.
Accreditation and all that goes into school accreditation, that becomes a priority for schools. But sometimes teachers look at that and say, well, that's not really my priority.
Right. Yes.
But it's something important that the school has to keep up with and make sure they're checking off all the boxes, if you will. I think the bottom line for teachers that can be difficult is they have very little control sometimes over the priorities, right? The priorities may be given to them and they may feel like they have not as much input into that. And that sometimes can be maybe a frustrating experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so in a school, there are procedures and many processes for everything, or so it seems. There are many gears that run a school, a lot of people in one space with a huge responsibility to accomplish. Since we're talking decisions, what are some common areas that could be potentially points of frustration? What did you find?
Yeah, I just have a list of questions to think about. What does this look like at your school? And as a teacher, did you get to really speak into this at all? Probably not, right? Maybe you did, but you might not. How things are turned in. How's payroll handled? Are you given a check every couple of weeks or every month, or is it, direct deposit? How does the car line work? How will calendar decisions be made? How are facilities and vehicles reserved? Your school handbook probably has, for faculty, hundreds of different processes and things that make your institution just work. And that's how they have decided it's going to work. But again, sometimes it's maybe not how you would do it. And so again, that can cause, a teacher to feel frustrated because it's not the way that they would do it. And again, there's many more than that. Those are just some simple practical things as a teacher. Processes are things we work with every single day.
Yeah, it is such a difference going from having been a teacher and then becoming an administrator. So as teacher, assistant principal, then principal, and just at each level pulling up to a higher level, and not meaning higher superior, superiority,
Totally.
but like looking bigger picture. And you don't, like in your classroom, your decisions, are over just a few group of a little group of people, and it doesn't matter how you turn things in or how you walk in your classroom. It just matters to you. It does matter, but it's just to your classroom.
Yes.
But you are right. Looking big picture, sometimes we know, looking big picture, if I decide this, it's going to affect this. And not everyone in their classrooms understands that. So
yeah, Jenny, I give kind of it's not a word picture. It's two slides that have a picture on it. But the first slide has just a very small piece of the picture, right? So you can't make out what the picture is at all. But I asked the folks in the room, hey, what is this picture? Right? And so nobody can tell. I mean, it's impossible to tell from the little piece that I pull out. But then when I give the big picture, you can see, here's where that piece fits in. And so as a teacher, again, you're looking at, for most of the time, your kind of one piece of the picture, but that leader has got to look at and see the whole picture.
Yeah, that's a great way to illustrate it. And kind of going with that, if we were, on that session that is your assignment to create, things that teachers wish administrators knew, is probably communicate to us. Because so often we as administrators can see a bigger picture. We make a decision, but then we fail to tell, why this is going to feel weird to you, but this is why. So I like what you said there. If we can fill in that picture for them too, that can help them understand a little better too.
Absolutely our responsibility as leaders to do that as much as we are able to. The difficulty is sometimes we're not able to because there's certain details that can't be shared.
For sure.
So that makes it a challenge. But as much as we can, we have to do that as leaders.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked people, priorities, process, but you also mentioned pastor. Can you unpack that a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, the reality that I share with our school leaders is that some decisions are made because it's what the pastor wants for that situation. And sometimes as a school leader, I may not have control over that. Now, I always say with this, in no way am I excusing, bad behavior, right? If something immoral, unethical, illegal I think hopefully your listeners would totally grasp that. Like we need to speak up and realize that needs to be handled appropriately. So I'm not really talking about that. I'm just thinking more in terms of regular day-to-day things. Sometimes decisions are made in a ministry that's a church-based school, especially because it's what the pastor wanted to happen. And so the leader has to carry that out, because in the end, that's that leader's, boss in some ways.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So that's the reality. But I finish this part by giving an admonition to leaders and to teachers. So here's my admonition to leaders.
That was my next question. Yeah. I wondered if you had one.
Yeah. Be gracious, realizing that those in your care may not see the whole picture. Help them see a bigger picture by sharing what you can about specific details, and be willing to take feedback and make changes when necessary, right? So our teachers come to us with ideas and things that could improve a process or a question about a priority. And if we can take their feedback and implement that, we would be crazy not to do that, right? Because we're not the ones that have to come up with all the ideas. But here's my admonition to teachers. Do you trust the heart of your leader? If you have questions, take it to your leader. But if you're unable to support the decision, you may need to look for employment elsewhere. And again, I'm not talking about issues, sin type issues. I'm just talking about, do you trust the leadership where you're serving? And if it comes down to it that you can't trust their heart, and again, not because of sin or illegal or immoral behavior, I would just encourage you that it may be time to find, another opportunity for ministry, because a team will not be able to be all that it can be in Christian education if some of the teachers just don't trust the leadership of the school. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Trust is so important. And it's okay if you feel like you need to move on. You want to serve somewhere where you can serve as a team, serve with unity, and serve with trust, like you mentioned. And, it kind of wraps up what you said. You said relationships is what we started. We started with relationships. We talked about decisions, and you mentioned taking the questions to the right spot. Well, that's part of relationships. If you don't understand a decision, taking to the right place, not to the teacher's lounge, to the other teachers, but actually going to the right person. So kind of not what you said, but tying together the two things we've talked about and pulling from that, going to the right spot is such an important thing as well. When you don't understand a decision, to keep that unity is going to the right person. Did you have something there?
No, I was just going to say, it doesn't mean we're not going to disagree. Like we may come down to something and disagree on that. And I don't think it will happen. Yeah. I don't think disagreement means we can't continue to work together. Like that's I hope no one takes that away. I mean, we will disagree on things, but sometimes, the leader in the end is the one that's going to make that decision. And so you bring your questions, your comments, your feedback, the leader makes the decision, and then you move on, right? Once the group makes the decision, or once the decision's made, then we move on and support that as best as we're able to do.
That's right. Yeah. And looking to the Lord for wisdom on that.
Absolutely.
You want to be aligned. But yeah, like you said, we're not always going to totally agree. It's what you can support and trust and all those things that come into that. So great advice. Matt, thanks for unpacking. This is so practical. These topics are so helpful. They are right down in the trenches, and ones that every Christian school educator faces basically every day, I'm sure. Absolutely. I know we talked about what administrators wish teachers know, but you also do have that assignment now to finding out what do teachers wish administrators know, and we'll have to definitely have you back. And I know there's more to this session that we didn't get to cover today because of time, but maybe as our listeners find you at different conferences, they'll be able to hear the rest of that.
Come and find me. I would love to meet teachers and listeners of this podcast. And yes, there is a whole lot more, but thanks for having me on to just share a little bit about this, because it's so important for us to just have a sense of unity as we work together. Again, we're not going to agree on everything, but the more we can get on the same page, I think God will bless that. And it will be a game changer for our culture and our schools, and just make it a better experience for our students and our families, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that working and serving together can be challenging at times.
Sure.
And we, like you said, we need God's grace and His unity to keep our spirits right and to keep us focused on the mission of impacting lives for Christ. So thank you for challenging us and reminding us of those elements today, Matt. Once again, it's been great having you back on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, and I look forward to 2 years from now hopping on again with you.
And hopefully sooner. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today as well. I hope you were challenged and encouraged as I was. Remember to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to learn more about this show and to submit questions for our upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day, but it's not just any day. Every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and also through His grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.